And you're trying to give the young people something that will help them, yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
As usual, I'd like to welcome you back to the podcast if you are a return listener, and welcome you to the podcast if you are a first-time listener. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm the Director of TeachThought Professional Development. A few housekeeping notes. I had mentioned in a few of the previous episodes that we would be pushing out some surveys to get some feedback from you on what you might be looking to learn more about. And project-based learning was one of the main things, so we will be launching a free weekly Lead Thought and Teach Thoughts series of the week starting June 6th. If you would like more information on that, where you can sign up and get those free resources, you can go to wegrowteachers.com/thoughts. I'm also excited to announce that we are going to be offering pre-registration for our annual PBL Grow events, which was canceled last year due to COVID, but we're going to try to offer that this summer, July 7th through 9th, here in Louisville, Kentucky, our home base. And so we're going to offer a pre-registration to gauge interest, as we're just a little bit unsure to see how many folks might be willing and interested in traveling and being together and doing a normal professional development like we used to do before pre-COVID. So if you're interested in that, navigate to wegrowteachers.com/grow21, and you can pre-register there and indicate your interest, and that will help us gauge whether we will be able to host that and offer that as we go through the summer. If you're interested in our other professional development opportunities to have us come to your school or to work with you online, please visit wegrowteachers.com. All of our services are there, and feel free to email me at drew@teachthought.com. In this episode, I spoke with Steve Pearlman, who authored a recent book called America's Critical Thinking Crisis: The Failure and Promise of Education. So as you might imagine, we talked a lot about critical thinking and teaching and learning and the ways in which that may or may not be happening in our K-12 and higher education courses. We talked about the access to knowledge and the importance of it, the sort of order of operations with thinking and knowledge, and whether thinking creates knowledge or you need knowledge to then to have something to think about, as well as sort of reading and whether that is for comprehension and evaluation. And we touched on some grading and assessment pieces and inquiry and lots of pieces that you might imagine that surround the, sort of debate of critical thinking. I'm certainly an advocate of critical thinking and this kind of an approach, so I tried to pose some questions, sort of devil's advocacy kinds of questions that folks who may be critical of this kind of approach might have. So I thought that was interesting, some of those pieces of our discussion. So I hope it's helpful. All right, Steve, we are live, and I'm with Steve via Zoom. He's connecting from Connecticut, and we're going to talk about his book called America's Critical Thinking Crisis: The Failure and Promise of Education. And in this conversation, I'm going to probably try to play some devil's advocate, because as I look through the book and certainly some of the pieces of it, I am in large way, in agreement. So hopefully we can find some points to sort of unpack and get some nuance. But let's give our listeners an opportunity to learn a little bit more about you and that kind of thing, so they have some context of who they're listening to.
Sure. Thanks for having me on. I've been I'm technically out of higher ed now. I was in higher ed for about 30 years at a number of different institutions. My doctoral degree is in composition theory. And so I spent the earlier part of my career teaching writing composition classes, early and advanced at universities. But that really led me into the study of critical thinking, because there's such an intimate connection between teaching people to write and therefore articulate and form thought and the nature of thought. And at my more recent work at a university was founding one of the first and only academic departments in the country specifically focused on raising critical thinking outcomes across campus. And that's kind of what led to the book.
Yeah, and it's an interesting... Well, there's several interesting things here, and I've had this discussion, or a similar discussion, and in some ways, maybe a bit of a debate, even on social media and some other places. But the sort of pushback on the behalf of some teachers and educators, and what I have found, or at least my intuition is, I'm curious if you have this sense as well. I don't know, sort of on an ideological spectrum, nor do I really find it terribly interesting, but where you might be on sort of left versus right, that kind of thing. But it seems to me that what I find is that maybe more right-leaning, maybe a sort of a libertarian-minded kind of educator really focuses on and pushes back against this idea that critical thinking it should be, at least as I understand it from your book, sort of paramount, like a first-order kind of thing that we should be focusing on, and that in their estimation, the pushback then, part of that is that knowledge and content is being sacrificed, and we can kind of dive into that. But I'm curious how, to the extent that you have any perception or intuition on that, have you got any sense of that, and sort of again, I don't want to get into politics of it necessarily, but sort of on that spectrum?
Well, actually, it's a really interesting question, and my journey with this book has been fascinating because most of the people who've shown interest in it in terms of interviews and podcasts and so forth, the bulk have been on the right, which has surprised me, actually, that I think they have a natural or a greater inclination or a more intrinsic connection to wanting to critique the educational system or be willing to take a hard look at it than sometimes people on the left. And that's just been my impression. I'm very surprised by it. Mm-hmm. It's been my impression since I've published the book and have been sort of doing the tour and so forth, and who's taken interest. Not only the right, but the right's been, and some very conservative shows have been very interested in the text, whereas fewer, more liberal-leaning places have, which is more where I am politically, but nevertheless, that's the case in terms of who's been reaching out.
Well, that is interesting, and I would imagine, so a more sort of right-leaning conservative in the culture war right now is highly suspicious of, especially higher education, critical race theory being thrown out there, 1619 Project, and I'm actually going to be talking with 1619 Project education folks here, I think later this week, so that'll be interesting. But that the sort of dissonance that at least I find, or I again would intuit, is that yes, those folks are much more willing, and perhaps even in some way tribalistically interested in criticizing education, mostly higher ed probably, but now it's extending down into K-12. And to be clear, I am interested in criticizing education too, but not in a tribalistic way, but just to make it better, right? And so that dissonance with what I find in many of those folks is that they are often knowledge first, that that critical thinking and inquiry and constructivist progressive teaching is doing a disservice. And I think there's tons of complexity and nuance here that those binary sort of false dichotomies is missing in, again, our tribalistic culture war kinds of arguments. But we can not get into the weeds on that. Probably doesn't make sense to get into the weeds too deeply on that.
No, but you raise a really great point about the two things. First of all, that in the left, or at least in academia in general, mm-hmm. there's really a great deal of dissonance about critical thinking that I've found, that we've discovered. It's in the research, but it's also in my personal experience. And nothing I say here is really, everything I say comes out of research. Nothing is my personal experience about, or my personal opinion about this. I mean, it's at least my interpretation of research, of course. But so when you say to people, well, is critical thinking very important to in education? We know that the vast majority of educators across the board say, of course, it's, upwards of 90% or more will say, yes, of course, it's exceptionally important. Then you say, well, are your kids good critical thinkers? Are your students very good at critical thinking? And invariably, the answer is no. My students not only don't think critically now, there's a strong perception that they're not thinking as well as they used to for the older educators, which I don't think is an accurate perception, but it's nevertheless our grass is greener kind of perception about this. And then you say, okay, well, so do you teach critical thinking then? And then you get people who generally will start to say yes. The research shows most educators will at first suggest that they're doing something toward critical thinking. And then you say, well, what do you do? How do you really do it? How do you know that you're having an effect? And then it all breaks down. And they say, well, we actually don't really know that we're teaching critical thinking or having an effect. And what we know is that the vast majority of the tactics that educators are using to teach critical thinking doesn't really work. So then you say, well, you admitted to me that you're not teaching critical thinking really, and that your students aren't doing it. And then when we reflect research back to them that shows that they're not doing it, then often they start to become, let's say, a little disturbed or upset by that. And they say, well, we're not showing you anything different than what you just told us. You said your students weren't thinking critically, and you told us that you're not really sure that you're teaching it. Now we're showing you that you're not teaching it. And now you're getting upset that we're criticizing education. But we just did the same thing that you said.
Right.
And then you say, well, here's how you could do it. There are ways that it could do it. Would you be willing to change? And they say, well, maybe not. And then we say, well, what reason? And then that gets exactly to what your other point was, which is why it's such a great connection and so savvy, which is that there's this perception that there's a conflict between teaching critical thinking and teaching content. Mm-hmm. And there is no conflict between those things. If we teach students to think critically well, we can go deeper into content. Critical thinking is the mechanism by which we can explore content further and more deeply in greater amounts of it. And so there's no conflict between those things. It's just understanding the right methods to doing it. So there's this great perception, though, that we have to make a trade-off.
Right.
And we don't.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well. And there's a reductivist sort of approach to, again, sort of a false dichotomy in which the conversation tends to be had in ways that is not productive and not moving that conversation forward. So certainly in the spirit of critical thinking, one of the things we want to do is unpack the sort of terminology with which we're working. And so it begs the question of, and you do this in the book in a broad sense, but how do you define critical thinking so that we can make sure that we're all talking about the same thing?
Sure, that's a great question, and it's the hardest one to answer. So in broad strokes, I think the problem with critical thinking is, and defining it and teaching it, is that, as I like to say, it doesn't have an exclusionary rule for what isn't critical thinking. There's not much in terms of any reasonable terminology that one would throw out at critical thinking that we would reject. So if we say, well, is it analyzing? Is it evaluating? Is it reading critically? Is it, ideating? Is it problem solving? Is it decision making? Well, of course, it's all of those things, right? And that list could go on and on and on. It's what some researchers referred to as sort of the dog's breakfast of terminology, because it's whatever you throw in the bowl is generally going to go there. And as we look at universities, and rubrics around critical thinking or programs around critical thinking, we actually see them succumbing to this problem, which is that they get so many different terms, so many different definitions, so many different ideas in there that it becomes unfathomable to really get your head around it, because it's everything. And that's where critical thinking education often breaks down, because how are you going to get people to do 50 million different things in the service of learning to think critically? Where my colleague and I differentiate ourselves from this, and where we come at it from a very different perspective, is that we can't go into the full definition now. It takes a little while to explain it, but we've rooted critical thinking back into what our brains naturally do neurologically and were evolved to do in terms of solving for problems, in terms of being a survival mechanism. And so there are certain mechanisms and processes that our brain goes through whenever they're facing any situation. And it doesn't matter if it's academic one or a personal one or what have you. They're always doing roughly the same process. And that's why the debate about whether critical thinking is something that's specific to a discipline or generic is really a very silly debate, right? Because our brains don't really work differently because we put us in front of a different classroom. The trick is finding those core mechanisms, and really what it's rooted in is the brain is ultimately always evaluating the circumstance to move away from danger and move toward reward. And at the nut, I mean, and we do something much more complicated on top of that in terms of really how to teach that process and refine it and exercise it and what's involved in it. But at the nutshell, that's what thinking is. It's the brain evaluating the context to move away from danger and move toward reward. There's nothing our brain wants to do more than that.
Yeah, I often frame it just for the simplistic or the ease of which teachers and educators, just can easily grasp it. Certainly Bloom's taxonomy is not the end-all be-all of what we might think of and how we think about teaching and learning and thinking cognition, but it is a fairly useful shorthand, if nothing else. And so we talk about critical thinking, especially being rooted in inquiry. And I know you talk a lot about inquiry in the book, but thinking about like the middle pieces, especially of that triangle, that pyramid, if you want to use that version of it, which is the most common one, that they analyze, they synthesize, right? That inquiry process. And I know we'll talk about PBL, project, we call it project-based learning. I think you refer to it as problem-based learning, and we can distinguish between how I think about those things. But that inquiry process being really, really important. And so, we don't want to just loiter at the bottom of Bloom's taxonomy and then remember and understand, which is the most traditional didactic direct instruction, which is not to say, it's just a side note, that direct instruction has no place, because it certainly does, and at least in my opinion, that there are places and times where direct instruction is perhaps very much the best way to help the learner think about things and make meaning of things. But I wonder too, I've been reading, it's from 1993, I don't know if you're familiar with the book Kindly Inquisitors by Jonathan Rauch, and yes. I'm finding so much of that, first of all, to be resonant in the culture war, and it's like a time capsule that predicts the future. But this terminology he uses there called liberal science, which to me feels like perhaps a root, or I don't know if it's what comes first or how they're connected. I'm curious how you might think about those things, sort of the connection between the idea of liberal science as we might apply it and the idea of critical thinking.
Well, yeah, I think they're intimately connected. I think the problem, so I love Bloom's, and Bloom's does us a great service, and the Anderson Crotwall, update of it, I think, is a good move. I think the problem with it is also that it's a taxonomy. Mm-hmm. He called it a taxonomy when really it's these things don't happen in the pyramidic structure that they're suggested, and I think that complicates it for actually a lot of people, because they try to get people to move up the pyramid, so to speak, and really it's soupier than that, and it should be treated as such. Mm-hmm. But I think the liberal science, or that kind of general mindset of being inquisitive and intellectually humble, as we like to refer to it a lot, I think is absolutely critical to critical thinking, because it's always with the presumption that the question's more important than the answer. There's more that we need to know. And we know also, and I talk about this in the book, but we also know, and this is something that we're constantly talking to educators about and people, is that we say it's much better to be smart than right. First of all, because right is typically unavailable to us for most interesting questions. Mm-hmm. We're never going to get to the right answer about how to solve racism. There are answers that are better than other answers, but there's no one right definitive answer to that very rich, complicated problem that we're facing, that we have to fight. Right. But there's not a simplistic, simple answer to that. Right. But there could be smarter ones. But the other problem is, and I think this is speaking to your idea, is that once we think we have the right answer, the brain stops thinking about it. The brain likes to move from cognitive dissonance, from cognitive disequilibrium to certainty. It's its main thing that it tries to do all the time. It likes certainty. And we have to teach it to become comfortable with being uncomfortable about that. Mm-hmm. And once we move to a place where we think we have an answer, we stop. The brain shuts off. It doesn't deal with that question anymore. And it's designed to do that, right? It's designed to then go on to think about the next thing, because it resolved that one thing. And I think that's where we see a lot of problem now, if we look into the country and politics and so forth, about people who might have erroneous ideas but are clinging to them, and a refusal to change. And why is that? Well, because they decided, and they have that belief persistence going on. But that's natural mechanism for their brain to do, is that once you have the answer, you stop thinking about it. You go on to the next problem. So it's hard to get the brain to go back. So I think for intellectual humility, it's absolutely critical to foster in everybody. And I think what we find is that when we teach students critical thinking, and we really teach them how to think through problems, what we find is that they become less certain, and they become more intellectually humble, because they see how rich and complex the problems can be. And they see that thinking about those nuances and the different aspects of it is the real goal. Not coming to an answer, a definitive right answer, is not the goal. And they see the complexity and the richness, and it makes them more humble, which it should. So it's a good sign that we're doing the right job, I think.
Yeah, I recently recorded a conversation for the podcast with a gentleman, Howard Burton, and he wrote a book. I don't have it in front of me, but it's essentially, he's Canadian, lives in France, and not an American, a United States American by, I guess, citizenship. So he's commenting on sort of the idea of American exceptionalism and that kind of thing. But one of the things that he really kind of leans into is this sort of critical thinking crisis as well. So we talked a bit about that. And, it really is what seems to be, I describe it recently as sort of people being in a trance. Like there is, and this is on the left and the right, and again, that's just the simplest shorthand, and it's certainly not the most comprehensively accurate way to describe our ideological spectrums and so on and so forth. But just for shorthand, that I put a tweet out this morning because it just strikes me as I continue to have conversations with people who seem to be further on the left and further on the right in this sort of trance, is that, again, in the context of liberal science, the people on the right so often are saying, well, first of all, I said, the people on the left so often, with social justice in particular, seem to be basically so impatient with liberal science and the sort of tedious nature and slow nature of progress that it does sort of produce and has produced. I mean, empirically, it's impossible to say that it hasn't produced those results, but there are two steps forward, one step back, and it is humanity is not pretty. It's a sort of, like you said, sort of soupy, right? And so my guess is, or at least some of them, sort of the intuition is that they are so sort of impatient with that slow progress that they seem to be discarding some of those liberal science principles that have brought us so much progress. People on the right yell at the people on the left for basically not engaging in critical thinking and liberal science, but they're also doing the same thing. And just as an added note, some of the folks who are sort of tribalistically, I say capital C conservative, because that's a sort of tribe in and of itself. When they hear the term liberal science, they say, "Oh, it's liberal. It must be bad," right? It's like, talk about the sort of lack of critical thinking going on here on all sides. And so, so how did we get here? Well, certainly the media and social media is part of that. I have, and you mentioned A Nation at Risk in the book, I have wondered how sort of the push behind like A Nation at Risk might have changed our education system towards something what I call an accountability, a culture of accountability versus one of teaching and learning, where the incentives are more about answers and getting the right answers and getting the test scores and things like that. And the opportunity cost and what we've sacrificed are the opportunities for teachers to sort of feel free and have the opportunities to have some of that dialogue, discussion, engage in that liberal science project and criticize each other and have disagreements and those kinds of things. That doesn't always directly lead to test scores, And so I guess I've wondered, maybe you can comment on this, is like the effect of a nation at risk, or was it something different that has put us on this trajectory, or am I totally wrong about that in completion?
No, I think you're really on track. So I don't know if it was just a nation at risk. I think the real problem happened back more at the turn of the last century in the Industrial Revolution, when they turned our schools into factories and they made them follow the factory model. And if you look at how our schools work, it's basically a factory, right, system that students move from grade to grade, level to level, on an assembly line, right? And they're expected to move every so often at intervals. And they move by getting a certain percentage, not even necessarily a very high percentage of the material. And then they're still moved along. So then what's that predicated upon? It's predicated upon, this is where you were headed, and I think A Nation at Risk made it worse, and then No Child Left Behind was a catastrophe, of course, but it's predicated on what's accessible, what's easily tested. Mm-hmm. And the easiest thing to test is, standardized knowledge, bits of information that don't necessarily have an application in the world at all, but nevertheless are something that the school can test. And that's easy way to assess the student's learning. It's the easiest way to assess the teacher's effectiveness. It's not the best way by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, it's testing. It's really assessing some things that we don't really want students to be able to do necessarily, And if you look at its bleed into politics and our world, what we have is basically, and I don't blame educators for this at all. It's a systemic problem. Educators, I know, don't like it either, and they're resisting it whether it's possible. But what we have is a system of basically to shortchange it a little bit and be a little oversimplistic. But we have a system where students are taught to be passive, imbibers of information. They sit passively for the most part, right? They're physically passive. They're for the most part intellectually passive, as they are getting information in and being, doing what they're told to do by an authoritarian figure in a classroom. And so then we had an authoritarian figure in the country who told them certain things were true, right? And it doesn't matter whether those things were true or not true. Mm-hmm. They had an authoritarian figure telling them that something was true. And we have a populace that's habituated to learn that and to ingest that as truth, and then spit it back onto a test, right? And I'm being unfair to the educational system in oversimplifying it, but nevertheless, there's a lot of evidence around this. So we say, well, how could this authoritarian figure rise to power and that could happen? Well, we have an educational system that's constructing it in a certain respect, to a degree. On the other hand, though, I think it's really important to note that there's a flip side to that, and it's the more liberal side of the problem, which is postmodernism, and the deep roots that postmodern has reached into the educational system, particularly in higher education. And the idea that, although I think there's a lot of truth and value to postmodernism, I think the problem is that there's also this idea there is no truth, right? There is no real reality, that everyone's truth is equal. Well, when we get to that point, it becomes harder at a certain point than to start talking about critical thinking, because then we're trying to suggest there should be some standard by which to determine whether or not people are thinking or not, or how effectively they're thinking. If we're going to teach it, there has to be a way to assess it. There has to be a way to know. And the resistance to that point of view often comes from the perspective that, well, everybody thinks differently, and that's great, and there's no way to think. But there's such an important distinction between suggesting, as I do, and my colleague does, that there's how to think, and that's not at all suggesting that there's a what to think, right? We're not suggesting that anyone should tell anybody what to think. We're suggesting that there are ways to refine the thinking process, but nevertheless we hear postmodernist objections to that perspective, whether they're framed literally in postmodernism or not, but sometimes they actually are. Mm-hmm. So I think we have these two different factors coming out from different directions in the educational system. One is very liberal postmodernist, and on the flip side of that, we have the structure of education, and that what's testable and what's easily testable is really what's least important. And we have those two things combining with a lot of other factors, including this factory model system that keeps pushing students, up the line. And all three of those things come together, and we have a real problem on our hands.
Yeah, well, the postmodernism is something that I've touched on, and I noticed that what strikes me, again, sort of lingering in the weeds of left versus right and the political ideologies of which our culture war is currently engaged in. I see so much of the same kinds of illiberal and honestly postmodernist kind of thinking happening on both sides, which is stunning when they accuse each other of it. I mean, Trump is clearly a postmodern, or was a postmodern president, right? Like, he has his own truths. Like,
Right.
the election was stolen. No, it wasn't. Well, yes, it was. Oh, okay. Well, that's your truth, right? And the book that I was referring to with Howard Burton was, like, people mistaking knowledge, or I'm sorry, opinion for fact, right? So now everybody has their own opinion and belief, and that is in certain circles and tribes is treated as knowledge and as fact. In reality, that's not true. But so then people say, how could they possibly think the election was stolen, or that whatever you want to use as an example on the left? Well, if you would consider the media that they are digesting and the information that they are being presented with, then it makes perfect rational sense in many ways. What they're not doing is seeking to disconfirm what they think is true. And that, to me, is the project of critical thinking and project of liberal science, is that, as you said before we started, I was saying, there's lots of agreement that I have with you, and perhaps, in the spirit of trying to have a better conversation here, I may disagree on some things or push back or play devil's advocate, and you said I'm happy to be wrong. And that, to me, is one of the missing things. Like, people don't want to be wrong. Matter of fact, they want to be right and make sure that everybody else agrees with them, so they will argue and share and whatever they can do to make sure that they can prove that they're right. And then in terms of, there's sort of a population of, and I would hope that this would be characteristic of educators in general. I don't know if it is. I hope it is. I don't know how we would ever figure this out, but that that we have a group of people who are saying, let's see where I'm wrong, and that we're trying to seek to understand and be understood, not necessarily prove that I'm right or that you're wrong. And what that is often, like, I get accused of being argumentative, or even say, that's insulting, or you're attacking me. No, my intent is certainly not to insult you. I don't ever want to do that, or at least rarely. It might be a time or two I want to insult somebody, right? Sure. Talk about road rage or something like that. But, the idea is that I want to question and I want to stretch your thinking. And that is so often seen as an attack or an insult, again, on the left and the right. And so that I would hope that would be something that educators could reasonably see through and work through, but I'm not sure that our teacher education programs are pushing or preparing our teachers to think that way, and I'm not sure that matter of fact, I'm reasonably sure that our incentive structure in schools is actually making it more difficult to do that.
Well, think about, so we spoke right before we went on air, and you were mentioning that the vast majority of your listenership are educators, right? And I would throw a challenge out as we're talking about all this to think about what percentage of educators do you think are listening to this? And again, I'm not blaming educators. It's a systemic issue. Educators, mm-hmm. I've worked with thousands of educators, and right. And they are, doing the hardest work and noble people, right. and often don't like the system that they're in. But how many have not, what percentage would you say have not penalized students for being wrong at a certain point, or for the most part, as the mainstay of what they do? Mm-hmm. So we have a culture that's built, that's reared in our school system to fear being wrong, to have been penalized for being wrong their whole lives, mm-hmm. when they were kids. And what we're advocating for, what I'm advocating for, is that we move to a different conception of education. That's not penalizing anybody for being wrong. It's because there is no right and wrong at that point. Not in the sense that there aren't certain facts that we could agree on or what have you, but in the sense that what we're assessing isn't whether you get a right answer or you know a certain fact. What we're assessing is how richly and complexly were you able to think through something, usually often conceive of the question in part as well. How richly we're able to do that. And we have a way to assess that. We've developed a way to make that assessment and see how richly and complexly could you think through something. Mm-hmm. And we're not really going to look at whether your answer is right or wrong. We're going to look at whether you use evidence effectively, whether you're respecting evidence, of course. But within the boundary of respecting evidence and interpreting evidence, if you're doing that in what's a fair way, mm-hmm. there are still ranges of opinions that one could have on a variety of, almost any rich, complex issue. Mm-hmm. It doesn't necessarily force you into a particular viewpoint. Now, that's not true with everything. There's not an argument that the Earth is flat. There's no legitimate evidence for the fact that the Earth is flat. And that's not what I'm suggesting, that we entertain those kinds of fantasies that aren't respecting evidence. I'm saying that we have to move away from making education about valuing rightness, and we have to move away from it being about factual knowledge, which increasingly has less currency in the world as it's changing so rapidly and as we need to progress more forwardly. But nevertheless, as you're saying, well, think about how often people are so offended by the idea of being wrong. Mm-hmm. Well, they've been taught to be offended by that. They've been taught to be penalized for being wrong. That wrong is one of the worst things one could be in school, is wrong. And that's a real problem, right? We got to start to think about education as doing something different than that, or we're going to keep running into this.
Yeah, we work a lot on inquiry skills and, getting teachers to think about the inquiry process. And as part of that is certainly every educator has to do assessment, and formative and summative assessment. And one of the things that I offer as at least something to consider, so I sort of butted up against that as a teacher. I was a teacher for 15 years, and I usually phrase it this way. I would notice, I'd stand out in the hallway. I was teaching, the example I use, I was teaching 9th grade integrated social studies, and so that was economics, geography, and government, which in 9th grade is not where I would ideally put it, but that's a whole other side issue. And I would do the obligatory standing in the hall during class break and changing, and you'd look down and I would give my students homework. I'd say, I want you to answer these 5 questions or whatever, so that I can know that you understood, or get a sense of whether you understood what we were talking about and what I was teaching. And I'd look down invariably and see, a student copying another student's paper, up on the locker. They're rushing to get the answers. And you say, well, why were they doing that? Well, it wasn't because they were trying to understand it. It was because they're trying to get their points, right? And to be fair, points and scores are a part of the equation that are in almost every school going to be there. So it's not like I'm saying, we have to do away with grades and points and scores. There's an argument to be had for what that looks like and how we do that differently. But what I started doing and said, so think about ways in which you can engage your students in the thinking and make it in some ways more safe, right? So I would say, here's 4 or 5 questions, short answer, and I want you to answer it. And then there would, it's called a confidence meter. So there'd be 3 circles, almost like a Venn diagram, overlapping. And the left circle was, I'm confused. Middle is, maybe I've got it. And right circle is, yeah, I think I've nailed this. I think I really understand it. And so answer the question, but also put a check mark on the top half of one of those circles. And my feedback to you is not, 5 points. My feedback to you is you're confused, or maybe you just haven't really explained it well, or you got it. And then that, of course, allows you to do some differentiation and reteaching and stuff like that. So giving teachers opportunities to think about ways and processes and systems in which they can shift that conversation away from the points and scores, and eventually, and I don't know how you feel about single point rubrics. I'm a big fan, and we talk a lot about single point rubrics as opposed to the sort of standard, 4 quadrants and, bullet points and trying to, 3s and 4s and things like that. But then on the other hand, there is, I'm imagining people listening who might be critics of this saying, all right, yes, there are things, and you sort of you touched on it. You're like, there are things that we have to know that these kids know, and there is, right? There are pieces of knowledge that are like, I want my two daughters to know the multiplication tables, not to have some variance on what they think it might be, right? So, like, what's the you touched on it a little bit when you were talking, but kind of what's the real response to that pushback of like, there are pieces of knowledge and things that all of our kids should know as they matriculate on K-12 into higher education?
Well, you touched on a couple different issues. I'll speak to that one first. I want to go circle back to grading, and that, I think that's very important. For the most part, I don't think there's anything that our kids need to know. I agree with you. Some of the math, absolutely, multiplication tables, unquestionably, things like that. I think the rest of it's more skill based. I mean, I think we have to have good reading skills, critical reading skills, inquiry skills, writing skills, group work skills, presentation skills, right? Things like that. What else do we need to know? Well, it's a fascinating question, and I think there might be a lot of things we would all agree on, and I think we have to obviously have some subject matter of education. They have to be thinking about something,
right?
And we might find a lot of places of agreement about that. I mean, I think it's important that they have some sense of the history of the country that we're in, some sense of the history of the world. I think it's important that students learn about the Holocaust, but other people might not put that as high a priority. Right? I'm sure most people would agree that should be in there somewhere, but none of it matters if they can't think about it. Right? There's not an iota of knowledge that's functional unless the brain can reason about it and use it in some way. And so, again, the predication on the what that we know has to be rethought and subordinated to a predication on how well we can think about things. And not just because thinking is such an important skill in itself, and not just because none of that knowledge has any function if people can't think about it and put it to use. There's a more important reason than that, which is that thinking creates information. It's not the other way around. And the example I like to use is Newton. So you say Newton came up with gravity. Well, how did he do it? I don't know if because this is the fable of it, right? But he's sitting under a tree and an apple fell and hit him in the head, right? And well, for thousands of years before Newton, people had seen apples falling from trees.
Right.
That data didn't change. There was trees, there were apples, things fell, other things fell down, right? And as the fable goes, at least the idea before that was it was God's will that it fell down. And then Newton at some point looked around and said, well, maybe there's still God, but he created these systems in place. And one of those systems is this thing called gravity, which is why everything always falls down and nothing ever falls sideways or up, right? But Newton created the information that was gravity. The data of things falling never changed.
Right.
So thinking is really what creates information and the functionality of information. And that's why it's so important. The other thing that I would, and it's much more important that students can ask the question that hasn't been asked yet and contend with the problem that we haven't faced yet, than it is that they know something that somebody else thought already. Now, they might need to know those things that other people have priorly thought, other people's ideas, so that they can solve for new things coming down the road. We have to have evidence and information from somewhere to address new problems, for sure. But the critical thing that we need them to be able to do if we're going to have a better world is have them be able to ask an interesting question and reason away to some kind of solution for it, albeit an imperfect one. Now, as you spoke about grading and points and so forth, I'm actually a big fan of grading. I think it's and scoring. I think it's important. I think the evidence supports it that students work harder when they know that they're going to be graded than when they're not. Now, let me before I lose too many people on this, let me bring it around, which is this. I also agree that the way we're grading students and what we're grading them on is highly problematic, and it's creating all this extrinsic motivation and stress about grades, and it's a number, and it's all this kind of stuff. We're putting a number on people. I get all that, But I don't think the answer to it, I think we've come up with the wrong answer to the problem. I think there is a problem with grades by far, but we've come to the wrong answer. The wrong answer has been sort of the anti-grading or move away from grades and let's take the emphasis off grades. And I think that's not the answer. I think the answer is to grade something that's authentic. I think what we're grading is inauthentic for students. So if we're grading how much they know, even say about the Holocaust, right? For most students, that doesn't have an application in their life. There's nothing they do with that knowledge when they leave school. So it's an inauthentic thing to grade because, whether they learn it or not really isn't meaningful to them. It's not changing their lives or improving or empowering them in any way to know that, as with most things in school. But if we're going to grade them, let's say, on how well they could think through something, not what they think about it, but how well they could think through something, that's authentic. And it's authentic for two reasons. The first is because, as I said, that has meaning to them outside of school. They can think better, and they can think better, and you learn that thinking system and apply it to anything they do, whether it be in school or out of school, then they're a more empowered human to go out into the world and do anything else that they want to go do in their life, which is great. But the second thing is, if we focus on thinking is naturally intrinsically motivating. Our brains like to think. We evolved to enjoy thinking. We actually get pleasure. We actually get releases in our brain of dopamine when we think and solve problems because our brains like it. They enjoy it. We're designed to it. Otherwise, none of us, if we didn't like thinking, the best invention we would have right now would be a sharper stick. That's as far as we would have gone.
If we didn't like thinking, it would be much easier to meditate.
Right, that's true. Yeah, as someone who has meditated, I appreciate that
because you can't stop thinking. That's the hardest thing, right? Yeah. Sorry, didn't mean to disrupt you.
No, not at all. So if we are measuring thinking, then we also move students away from the problem of being extrinsically motivated. So when students come into my class, they're first extrinsically motivated. And the way I work on a mastery level, so they have the semester to do as well as on the paper as they can. And most of them almost exclusively fail the paper the first time that they try. And I tell them that this is going to happen. This is not a surprise, and it doesn't count for anything. Only their final end grade counts. So they've got a whole semester to do great on the paper. And at first, they're all extrinsically motivated. They want to get a good grade. When they get involved in the thinking process, though, about the subject matter, we teach them how to think, and they really engage it. That extrinsic motivation goes away. I can't tell you the number of times students come and say, I don't even care what I get. Or I've had students who've gotten an A who've still rewritten their paper after they've already achieved an A, just because they wanted to still make it better. After the semester was over, I've had students go back and work on the paper further when it couldn't affect their grade at all. So we can move students to a place of intrinsic motivation, which is natural for critical thinking. We can assess them on something that's authentic, and we can keep grading that way and keep using that and move away from the other kinds of things that are the problems with it.
Yeah, I like the way I think Thomas Guskey refers to grades. I think it's him, and if it's not him, then I apologize. But sort of like grades are sort of in many ways a marker of somebody's progress, but it's not the end, right? I mean, right. In a summative sense, in a course it may be, but the way that you're describing that process and progress that somebody might make on writing this paper is that you might grade them early on in, let's say, the semester, and they may get a D or whatever shorthand you want to use for grades or points, but then as they continue, that grade changes because it's a dynamic process and the status updates. One thing that as you're talking, it is interesting or sort of strikes me that that idea of thinking creating knowledge being something that might resonate with people who are pushing back on this idea that that progressive constructivist teaching is knowledge light. And I agree with that idea that thinking creates knowledge. I mean, the example that sometimes I use is like Google has all of this information but can't really do anything unless you ask it the sort of right prompts or questions or ask, right. Put the right search terms in, right? And so the pushback that I hear is, well, and you mentioned is like, you can't think about nothing. You have to have some content, some knowledge, something to think about. And I say, yes, I agree. But what I think you're missing in that conversation, what they're missing, is that there's sort of order of operations. And so we talk about inquiry being what we call rich inquiry in our project-based learning model. And the idea there, again, we lean into Bloom's taxonomy because it's a simple shorthand, and I agree it's not a step-by-step, but we talk about it in the context of that sort of pyramid that everybody's familiar with. And we say, all right, instead of starting at the bottom of Bloom's taxonomy with your students, that, you've got to sort of front load all this stuff. You've got to, might be, and often is, sort of lecture. I've got to do this direct instruction, this didactic stuff. They've got to read all this stuff. Once they get that knowledge, then they can go do stuff with it. And I say, there's some truth to that, but you're missing a step before that not only activates some critical thinking, but also helps the students develop and practice a skill of inquiry, which is a critical thinking, problem-solving skill that we not only want them to be applying in this scenario, but future academic settings, whether it's in that class or other academic settings, but really, in reality, in life, right? As I'm thinking about, I want to buy a house. What are the questions I need to know and think about in order to do this well? Not just do it, but do it well. And there's the critical thinking in that, defining and unpacking what do we mean by well. So we say with project-based learning, we ask them to create something. So how can we design? How can we develop? Whatever that verb is, but it's analogous to create. And in the process of unpacking the need to know and learn list is what we call it. So what do we need to understand and remember, essentially, those bottom pieces of Bloom's taxonomy. And so what I frame it and talk about it is instead of push teaching, it's pull teaching. So we're trying to pull those questions with facilitation skills as teachers from students. Now, part of that conversation is that the planning and architecture and design of the project, you as a teacher started with that understand and remember in the design. Like, I identified those are the content pieces I want them to think about. I want to ask them, I want to try to pull those as questions from my students, and then we get them up on this need to know and learn list, and then we teach to them. We teach and we think about them, we analyze them, we synthesize, and we do the critical thinking pieces, all in service of that creation piece. So while somebody might say, you can't ask questions about something that you know nothing about, I say, of course you can. You just are going to ask better questions the more you know about it, right? So if they know nothing about it, then create a little bit of context, get them asking questions, and then use that as the entry point to just sort of dig in. So I don't know if that makes sense.
It does. And, I think of it similarly, but a little bit differently.
Okay.
I don't think this isn't what you were suggesting, but like you, I also really push back against the idea that information comes first and then thinking comes second. I mean, I think that's such a misnomer. It's such a misconception of how our minds work and how we can learn. Because if we treat the information as static, then we've already lost, right? Because then there's this actual thing to be absorbed instead of engaged. What we know is that if we teach somebody to read, and we teach them to read to understand, that they can do that to a certain degree, which is how most students are taught to read. They're taught to read to understand. So the answer would be, what is this piece saying? Can you summarize what this author said?
Comprehension.
Yeah. But we know that's not really effective relative to teaching them to read to evaluate, which is not asking what it was said, ask it how it was said. How did this author make the point? What evidence did an author use in the service of the idea that the author was presenting? How did they construct it? What language did the author use? How would you interpret that language use? Is some of it as accurate as it could be? And so on and so forth. So there are other evaluative reading skills that we can do, or we might call them critical thinking reading skills that we can do. Well, now we're not reading to acquire information. Now we're reading critically. We're thinking as we're engaging that information. And it might be the case. It certainly is the case. If you want to solve, any problem or engage in any project, yes, you need to know more about it in order to come to a more effective answer and more effective questions along the way. Certainly that's without any discrepancy. But how you get there to ingesting and acquiring some knowledge about that can be very different paths. And one is to teach it as this static information that then we're going to go back and think about. And the other way is to say, you're going to start thinking about it from the start. and start framing your questions from the start, because we're going to teach you to read and acquire, or however we're doing it. If it's not a reading, it's evaluating or thinking through discussion or what have you, right? We're going to teach you to start engaging it critically from the beginning, and not looking at it as something to be known, but looking at it to be something to be engaged. Now, along the way, does the student, if we give them that reading skill, do they still learn what the piece said in terms of comprehension? Of course. But they learn the things that the students who just read to comprehend didn't learn, all right, about the construction of that piece, the language, the interpretation, the so forth, the argumentation, the use of evidence, and so on. They learn a lot more. So it takes the same amount of time eventually to read if you're going to think critically as it is to read if you're going to comprehend. But their comprehension actually goes up, and their persistence for that information is longer, and the depth of that knowledge is deeper. And it hasn't cost us anything, right? And this is what I mean. There's no conflict between critical thinking and learning. Critical thinking is the engine of learning. We just got to get students to do it more.
Yeah. So one of the things you mention, and sort of maybe is an interesting piece to discuss, is the sort of role of lecture. And I, again, as I would describe myself as in some ways, at least in some ways, a progressive educator, constructivist, inquiry, and because I think that is an important way to teach and think about teaching and learning, I want to make sure that we're doing it well. And so one of the criticisms is that it's sort of free range kids and that kind of thing. The more progressive educators would sort of use the idea of lecture as a weapon. Like, okay, so all you want to do is lecture, right? That's all you want to do, is instead of I'm over here doing projects and doing interesting stuff, and all you want to do is lecture. And again, there's a false dichotomy there. And one of the things that I try to say to some educators who are resistant to more constructivist inquiry kind of teaching, critical thinking as a focus, is that lecture, I think, has some place in some of these projects and settings, direct instruction, didactic sometimes, and to that extent when we do workshops, there are times when in some ways I'm doing what might be viewed as lecture. Now, my question is, as teachers, if you are lecturing, how do you know that, first of all, you want to make sure that that's the best way for students to get that information that might be necessary, but also, are you doing any assessments, some formative assessments to make sure that they're understanding? Otherwise, it's essentially a TED Talk, and you might as well just be recording it and putting it out into the ether. So, how do you think about the role of lecture in your ideas of teaching and learning?
Well, I do think there's some place for didactic instruction, but I think that it's the percentages are all wrong for the most part. In terms of what we see, lecture should be occasional and rare. Even the mechanisms that most people are using to substitute for lecture aren't developing more critical thinking in students, or even aren't perceived as student as much more active. So we know from most of the research that when we ask teachers how active is your teaching, and then we survey the students consider it far less active on the whole than the faculty do. The students are not feeling that they're actively engaged. The fact that we're even running a class discussion, if the teacher is the hub of that class discussion, students don't feel that's a particularly active experience. It's a little bit more active than lecture. But again, lecture is mostly predicated on the idea that there are things students need to know, which again is the fundamental flaw of the start of our process here. Because then you ask people, what do they need to know? I say, well, they need to know about X, right? And if you say, well, why? Why do they need to know that? They say, well, they do, they do. Well, that's a lot of the answer that we get. So some of the rest of it goes back to, well, they need to know certain things for the profession and what have you. And they say, well, how much do they really need to know? And how much are you saying you think they need? Or how much do you think your colleagues, or you're saying that because your colleagues also think they need to know that, but how much do they really need? And often we can whittle that down. Anyway, let me go back to lecture. So we also know from the science on this, they did an fMRI study. They put brain monitors on students for a week in college. Had them walk around for a week with brain monitors on 24/7. And they measured the amount of brain activity going on basically over the course of that week. And there's a certain amount going on when they're socializing, and a certain amount going on when they're eating, and a certain amount going on when they're doing homework and, whatever. The least brain activity was shown in class. So when I venture this criticism of lecture, it's not that it's my opinion that lecture isn't necessarily very constructive. It's that we basically know that if the more you're teaching, the more you're talking, the less they're thinking. And there's a pretty direct correlation between those two things, because there's a difference. And teachers will say, well, I get them involved in this really interesting discussion, so they must be thinking. No, that is utterly incorrect assumption to make. I'm saying this from a scientific perspective. There's a difference between having an interesting discussion about an interesting idea and teaching students how to come up with their own interesting idea about which somebody else should have a discussion. We have to teach students how to come up with their own interesting ideas. That's thinking. Talking about someone else's interesting idea, or an idea that the teacher thinks is interesting, isn't necessarily critical thinking. There could be some critical thinking happening there, but we know that group discussion doesn't improve critical thinking any more than lecture, and lecture doesn't improve critical thinking at all. And this is based on all the research that's been done. Neither does most of the tactics being used in classes. Unless there's a real thinking system being taught and practiced, then it's not going to come through osmosis for students. And we know that there are differences between smart and thinking skills. So people can be intelligent and not have strong critical thinking skills. Thinking skills are distinct, and there's overlap between them, right? Of course, right? But they're not necessarily hand in hand. So just the fact that you have smart students in your class doesn't necessarily mean that you're teaching them to think better, which is really where we want to go. So I think every once in a while, is a lecture valuable? Of course it is. And as I talk about problem-based learning or project-based learning as you do it, there are those moments where the simplest and easiest thing to do as the educator, and the best thing to do as the educator, is just give them some knowledge that they might need about that. Drop some knowledge at those moments. But it should be rare moments, touch points that are unique, and not the mainstay of what we do at all. So when I used to teach writing when I was teaching, and I did it the way most people would do it. I would start the semester, and I would eventually, at some point early in the semester, start talking about the need to develop a thesis statement. And my students will, they've probably gotten, I was in college, so most of them have had some lecture on a thesis statement before, or some lessons on how to write one and have practiced it. And it doesn't matter. Most of their theses still weren't very successful. And these were even at relatively elite colleges. And I would give them this lecture on it. And, I would do great presentations. Students love my presentations. I did a great song and dance, and we'd talk about it and practice it and so forth. And then the theses still weren't very successful. Well, I stopped doing that. And I started getting students into class, and I gave them the assignment, which is to think critically about, something in their writing and so forth, and let them start doing it. And they failed. And again, didn't count. It was formative, but they failed. And we were reading each other's papers too. We were workshopping it, reading what each other wrote, and they realized that everyone's failing. You know what happened after it happened is I did this for years. So as it would always happen about, a few weeks into the semester, maybe a month tops. At some point during one of our discussions, a student would stop and say, hey, none of us are passing these papers. None of us know how to write a thesis statement, apparently, because none of us even know what our papers are about when we read each other's works. Could you tell us how to do that? And then I'd go, oh, yeah, it just so happens.
Right.
I have this little lesson prepared on a thesis statement. Lo and behold, I could do that right now for you. Would that be useful to you? Oh, yeah, that would be useful to us. Right? Because at that moment, they wanted it, and they knew they needed it. And the problem with most lecture is not only the nature of the didactic structure of it and what it does, and just shuts people's brains off. But the problem is that we're lecturing about things that they don't know why they need it yet, right? The crazy thing about school, if you think about school relative to life, the crazy thing about education is that the questions come after the answers. So we lecture to students, we give them all this information. Those are the answers. Then the questions show up when they get tested. They often don't know what the questions are for which they have the answers until the test.
Right.
That's backwards to life. Yeah. In life, we always have questions first, and we seek out answers.
Yeah.
So it's an insane reversal and the brains don't like it. Doesn't work.
Yeah, so the dynamic that you described there with like students essentially saying, hey, I need to know, we need to know how to write a thesis, and coming to that is sort of how I frame, like this idea of pull teaching. And I don't like to put it in an economic marketplace sense, but there's a dynamic that or a graphic that I use sometimes to sort of illustrate this, that is in a sort of marketplace of ideas. Like, one is that push teaching, right? So that pushy salesman, and almost every teacher can identify with that moment of like, I'm trying to be the salesperson to convince these kids that, hey, you really need to know this. This is important for you to know, which is, it's going to be on the test. It's going to be for a grade. I say you should need to know it, or you're going to need this in the future. None of those things tend to resonate in large quantities of students. And so what we're left trying to do is to try to put on a dog and pony show. And if it's a lecture, then of course we want to make sure that it's, song and dance and, whatever we're trying to entertain. And that does happen. And sometimes that can work, but it's awful short-lived and sort of fool's gold. So then how do we shift that and sort of do the supply and demand kind of dynamic of pull? Like we talk about, I think that the graphic mentions or uses like automobiles. So automakers won't make a certain automobile until there's a demand for it. And so, we have identified that we need to know these three things. There's a demand for it, and ideally, when I go in project-based learning especially, we go and do an observation and give teachers feedback. One of the things I say is I will ask your students, what are you doing? And then ask them, why are you doing that? And the ideal answer, and it has happened, and I wish I had somebody videotaping this, is that the students will say, I'm researching this, or maybe even listening to this lecture because I'm trying to answer that question, and that will help me answer that question. So that's that pull dynamic. And I think that is such a major shift in mindset for so many teachers and educators, and really just people in general. I can imagine, as you're talking, sort of like the way that you phrased it, somebody who, again, is resistant to this kind of education of constructivist is saying, he said how do we know if they need to know that? And so I'm imagining, one, that as somebody saying, this guy thinks there are things that we don't need to know, and that there's not significant things that, we can just whittle it down. They really don't need to know that kind of thing. And I think there's a reasonable argument to be made there. The other thing I can imagine, especially in higher ed, is I've heard this sort of argument is that, yes, there's lecture, but there's also sort of a weeding out process that we want to engage in. And those kids who are motivated and do make that connection of this lecture is important, not just because I'm supposed to comply, but I see the relevance in what I'm trying to do. Those are the ones we want to matriculate further, and the other ones will fall by the wayside. And so there's some sort of weeding out process.
Well, I have no problem with weeding out processes. In fact, I mean, I'm not sure college is for everybody or what have you. And I think that there are people at different skills and different arenas, and that could be in subject matters as well. Mm-hmm. But I don't want to create a system built on what I would consider to be faulty premises for the sake of weeding somebody out. I mean, we can weed somebody out by authentically looking at things that I think it's important for them to have intrinsically. And there might be some who will rise and fall within that structure regardless. But we don't have to give them knowledge that they don't need. And let's go back to this idea of, well, there are things they need to learn. Let's break that down and see what really that means for most cases, for most subjects that people are learning in school. For most people, even in higher education, okay, even in people in doctoral programs. Well, so you say, well, how much they need to have all this information in my class. Okay. What do they need to pass your class? Well, let's say 75. Usually it's more like a 65. Let's say it's 75. So now you really just admitted to me that they don't need 25% of what you just said they needed already, because they can get out with 75%, right? Yes. Okay. So they don't need that all. No, I guess not. They really don't, because they get out with less. Okay. How much 3 months later after your class does the typical student remember from what they learned of that 75%? I don't know. Well, a typical fall off is about 60% in 3 months. Okay. How much are they going to remember in 2 years? Oh, well, I don't know. Well, yeah, usually it's virtually nothing, right? Very little bits that people remember 2 years after most classes. Okay. So what did they really learn? Right? What you just said, all this information is so important, and it doesn't matter the subject, right? Now, there are going to be those few students who are those ones who are the history buffs, who in the history class are going to remember the history things, a lot of them, right? Mm-hmm. They love history. And there's some students who just have really great memories who are going to remember, right? And there are those. And then there are the students who are going to go on into a field of practice where some of that knowledge is going to have currency and it's going to get reiterated and used, and then it's going to stick with them.
Right.
Right. And that's important for those certain fields. There's certain things you have to know in certain fields to be sure, right? But for the most part, look at what we just did, though, right? The vast majority of what students learn in education that they supposedly have to know, they don't have to know. They don't get all of it in that one class usually. Most of them aren't getting all of it anyway. And then a few months later to a year later, a vast majority of it's gone. So what is this thing that we're saying that, well, they have to know all of this? Isn't it more important? Not that they shouldn't study certain things or learn about certain things. And again, we could debate what those things are. I think there'll be a lot of agreement around it. But isn't it more important that we're giving them the capacity and the inclination to want to look at where there are problems, be able to go after those, solve those problems, and in the process of that, learn things, of course, and learn other people's ideas, right? But we've mostly trapped students into living in other people's ideas, reading about other people's ideas, learning about what other people have done, rather than empowering them to go do these things themselves. Again, in the process of going to do these things, they are going to learn what other people have done in those areas, and they're going to make connections, and they have to learn other things. I'm not suggesting that knowledge isn't important.
Right.
I'm suggesting that knowledge should be functionalized, and that we should teach them that knowledge should be used in application to make their lives better, to solve problems for other people, and make the world better. That's the only point that I'm making here.
Yeah, and I that resonates with me, and I certainly understand it. I use the example, especially in oftentimes working with K-12 teachers, like almost everybody, at least my age, was required to memorize the states and capitals. Mm-hmm. And it's certainly not unimportant to know the states and capitals, or at least maybe even to learn them as a process. There's some use to that. But I say, all right, so you probably, used a mnemonic device or something, and many of you, maybe all of you, memorized them at one point. But what's the capital of, Wyoming, or, some places that they just don't think about very often? And, the number of responses that are correct are, very few in lots of cases. And then I say, what if we happen to be in Wyoming, you say, well, what's the capital of Wyoming? They go, Cheyenne. Oh, well, how do you know that? Well, it's because we use it. Oh, yeah, because I have to send money there, and there's utility to that knowledge, whereas those other things haven't endured and wasn't durable because I'm not using them. And I would imagine, though, as somebody who's, again, sort of listening and thinking, yeah, but one of the fears, and I do think there's a reality to this, there's some validity to this sort of fear, is that the thinking the way that you're talking, the fear is that teachers might engage in a more progressive, constructivist education kinds of approach, and not actually give opportunities to and present lots of content and knowledge. And that's one of the things I push back on and say, look, let's be clear. We need, first of all, they have to have something to think about, so you can't do it about nothing. And if you say, these are the things I want them to think about, the cognitive landscape and terrain I want them to traverse, then plan for that and take them through that, whether they need that going forward or not, and whether it endures or whatever, but give them, don't dismiss loads of knowledge just because you want what is often behavioral engagement, and sometimes even cognitive engagement, like this sort of free-range chicken that I sort of joke about. I'm mindful of time, but one last question that might be helpful for folks who are listening, like what are the reasons, or what are the things and barriers or ways in which we shift the ways K-12 and perhaps higher education to engage and do more of the critical thinking? What's in the way, and how do we get there?
It's a great question. I think what's in the way for the most part is that most educators I've encountered certainly don't really know what the alternative is, right? You talk a lot about project-based learning and so forth, and I think some of that's making the rounds now more, which is a big key, I think, one of the big keys to the problem. But when we say, well, how do you assess critical thinking? They say, well, you don't know. And so one of the things we did was figure out how to assess it. And that makes a big difference because it gives us that thing that we can then do and know if we're doing it or not in the classroom. Structurally, I think the bigger barriers are more challenging. I mean, internally in somebody's class, we can change that individual class. We can make it a thinking-based class, a reasoning-driven class, a project-based class, a mastery-based class. We can do all those things in a single classroom. There'll still be plenty of knowledge being learned. In fact, more knowledge being learned. But in terms of larger systems, right, I think the pressure is going to come from the business world, and it already is starting to on education. And I think that's what's going to really motivate the change, unfortunately. I'm not saying that's the ideal way for it to happen. I don't think it is. We should be more responsive internally in our educational system. But I don't think it's going to happen. I think the problem is that other countries are making the shift already. A couple of years, China actually changed all of its higher educational institutions to focus on problem solving and critical thinking and ideating, because they realize that, the way the future of the country is going to depend on whether or not it has citizens who are capable of thinking critically and creating new ideas and innovating and so forth. Now, I don't think they did it very well, right, necessarily. And they have their own cultural barriers to that, just like we have cultural barriers at different ones, but they have theirs. But nevertheless, they're making the effort. And there are a lot of countries that are making that effort now, a lot, especially in the Pacific Rim. And if we don't do that, I think the pressure is going to come from our business community to say, hey, we need you to produce us critical thinkers and ideators. We need that. And I think that's eventually what's going to force higher education to change. And then when higher education changes, I think K-12 will change in response, because they're going to want to get students into those schools and start giving them those skill sets that are valued in higher education. Again, I'm not advocating that that's the best way for this change to happen. It would be much better if it bubbled up rather than it was driven from the top down, and we'd all be better for it. But I think that's how it's going to go.
Yeah, interesting. I just recently, another podcaster recorded a gentleman named Cornelius Grove, and his latest book is about is actually a look into Asian kind of thinking and education. And I think one of the perceptions, according to him, a large misperception, certainly one that I had or have, is that Asian education, East Asian education is so, like really didactic and really, discipline and drill and all those things. And what he found is actually quite a bit we, at the end of the conversation, I was saying, he said, you would fit perfectly well in lots of these East Asian educational settings, which, I would probably have said quite the opposite going into that. So interesting. Steve, I want to make sure that folks have a way to reach you and find you. The book, again, is America's Critical Thinking Crisis, The Failure and Promise of Education. And Stephen Pearlman, officially Stephen Pearlman, where should they find you, and where do you want them to go?
Yeah, please reach out to me at thecriticalthinkinginitiative.org. That's thecriticalthinkinginitiative.org, or you can reach me at s.pearlman@thecriticalthinkinginitiative.org. So, for consulting or whatever, please or if you just have questions, always happy to speak with everybody. Please get in touch.
And any social media that you want to mention?
I'm probably on. Probably on Instagram. But we do have a Facebook page and stuff. Okay. You can follow us there as well. But
okay,
yeah.
Well, I'll look on the site. We'll put it in the show notes for those folks who are listening on Apple Podcasts, which is where most people listen. We cannot include or embed links, so you'll have to go to WeGrowTeachers.com and this page, or the page specifically for this podcast. So, Steve, again, thanks so much. Interesting conversation, and hopefully useful to the folks listening.
Thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
That'll do it for today's podcast episode. Thanks again for tuning in. Don't forget to review us and share us on your network so we can grow our audience to better meet your needs. Also, don't forget to find us on our websites, teachthought.com and wegrowteachers.com, as well as our various social media outlets.